Two Tasmanian devils named Lisa and Lenny walked out of a crate in November 2020 and disappeared into the bush of the Barrington Tops in New South Wales. Nobody knew if they would survive, nobody knew if they would breed, and nobody knew whether 26 animals stepping onto soil they had not touched in roughly 3,000 years would actually do what the scientists were betting they would do: start dismantling one of the worst ecological disasters in Australian history. What Tim Faulkner and his team at WildArk had built over the previous decade was not just a breeding program. It was a calculated attempt to solve two crises at once: rescue a species that was being eaten alive by a contagious cancer in Tasmania, and use that same species to claw back a mainland where feral cats and foxes had been systematically wiping out native animals for over 200 years. Scientists call it a double rescue. What actually happened after those gates opened is something most people still have not heard about. Tasmanian devils once lived across the entire Australian continent. Fossil evidence places them in the central desert, the tropical north, the temperate south, everywhere. For millions of years, they filled the role of apex scavenger and mid-sized predator across every major ecosystem the continent had to offer. Then, roughly 3,200 years ago, they vanished from the mainland almost entirely. Research published in 2018 put the extinction window between 3,179 and 3,227 years before present. That means the disappearance of devils and thylacines from the mainland happened within decades of each other, not centuries apart as older estimates had suggested. The most likely driver was competition from dingoes. Dingoes arrived in Australia around 4,000 years ago. They hunt cooperatively, and they never reached Tasmania, which is why devils survived there. The island became their last refuge by accident, not by design. But in Tasmania, a different clock started ticking. Devil facial tumor disease is a contagious cancer that spreads when devils bite each other during feeding and mating. It causes tumors to grow around the face and mouth until the animal cannot eat. It's fatal, it's fast, and it had no natural check. By the time WildArk started its breeding program in 2011 with 44 individuals, the disease had already cut the wild Tasmanian population by more than 80% in under 20 years. At the low point, estimates put just 25,000 devils remaining in the wild across the whole island. Faulkner's program was built as an insurance policy. If the disease kept spreading unchecked, there needed to be a healthy, genetically diverse population somewhere that had not been exposed. WildArk became the largest captive insurance population on mainland Australia, eventually housing more than 200 animals, roughly half the entire captive population nationally. More than 390 devils were born and raised there over the course of the decade, but the goal was never to keep them in cages. Every decision, every breeding pairing, every husbandry choice pointed toward the same endpoint: putting them back outside in a real ecosystem, doing what they were built to do. While WildArk was quietly building that population, Australia's mainland was getting worse. Feral cats arrived with European colonization and never stopped spreading. Today, they occupy the entire continent and kill an estimated 1 to 2 billion native animals every year, a number so large it barely registers as real. Lizards, small marsupials, ground-nesting birds, rodents, anything in the critical weight range between 35 grams and 5.5 kilograms is vulnerable. Australia holds the world's worst mammal extinction rate, and feral cats sit near the center of almost every case. Foxes compound the problem. They also arrived with Europeans, also spread continent-wide, and also kill beyond their immediate hunger. Research has documented what ecologists call surplus killing, where introduced predators slaughter prey far beyond what they need to eat, partly because native animals never evolved defensive behaviors against them. They simply do not know to run. The obvious solution, reintroducing dingoes, had real problems. Dingoes do suppress cats and foxes, but they also kill livestock and prey on some of the same small native species you are trying to protect. Farmers resist them. The politics are a mess. What conservationists needed was something that would push feral predators out of their territories without tearing apart the agriculture industry in the process. Devils do not prey on livestock. They had coexisted with small native marsupials across the continent for tens of thousands of years before the dingoes arrived. And in Tasmania, wherever devil populations stayed healthy, feral cats retreated. The Barrington Wildlife Sanctuary in New South Wales took years to prepare. A fenced area of 400 hectares in the Barrington Tops had a predator-proof perimeter, with foxes and cats cleared out before a single devil set foot inside. The fence was not just to keep predators out. It was to keep the devils in long enough to establish territory, learn the land, and stop associating humans with food. An animal that connects cars or people with a meal is a dead animal the moment it gets moved somewhere with roads. WildArk selected the 26 animals specifically to avoid inbreeding. Every pairing in the program had been tracked across the decade, so the release group had the broadest possible genetic spread. 7 of the 26 were reproductive females, which put the theoretical ceiling for first-year joeys at around 20, though nobody knew whether any would actually make it that far. Once the gates opened in late 2020, Faulkner's team pulled back deliberately. Camera traps recorded movement, radio collars tracked territory. But the animals were not managed, they were watched, because the whole point was to see whether a species absent from this soil for 3,200 years could find its footing without a safety net. By May 2021, rangers confirmed 7 joeys in pouches across the first monitored females. They were healthy, developing normally, and carried by mothers who had never lived outside a managed facility before the release. Faulkner described it as nerve-wracking, watching from a distance, waiting. The joeys were the proof of concept, not just that the animals had survived the winter, but that they had settled deeply enough into the landscape to breed. 2 sisters who had been separated before the release were found sharing territory 2 years later, picked up by the same camera trap. The land was already being divided, mapped, and claimed. What happened to the cats is where the story gets harder to explain, but easier to understand once you know what a devil actually does in an ecosystem. Devils are not fast. They do not run down prey the way cats do. What they do instead is something more structural. They are the continent's most efficient scavengers, animals built to process carcasses completely, bone and all, leaving nothing behind. That total consumption matters more than it sounds, because rotting carcasses are how disease spreads and how scavenging cat populations stay fed between active hunts. Remove the food subsidy and the population thins. Put a territorial predator in the same landscape that actively harasses smaller carnivores near food sources, and you get what ecologists observed in Tasmania when devil populations were still intact. Cats pulled back. Not eliminated, but compressed, pushed out of the zones where devils were actively moving and feeding. The Tasmanian evidence was the scientific premise for the whole reintroduction. Studies showed that when devil numbers crashed because of the facial tumor disease, feral cats moved into the gaps almost immediately. The relationship worked in reverse too. Where devil populations held, cat activity stayed lower. The mechanism is not outright predation, though devils will kill smaller animals. It is territorial pressure combined with resource competition. Cats are opportunistic and they are not suicidal. When something heavier, louder, and less avoidable than them starts claiming the same patches of bush, they shift. Paleontological records add a longer frame to this. Fossil evidence from sites in the Willandra Lakes region in New South Wales shows that devils and small native marsupials coexisted in the same ecosystems for possibly 30,000 years through ice ages and warming periods without small species collapsing. That is the pattern the reintroduction was designed to restore, not a pristine pre-European baseline, which does not exist anymore, but a functional predator hierarchy where native apex animals do what they evolved to do and introduced predators face resistance they did not have before. What WildArk's Barrington Sanctuary represents is a controlled test of that theory in real time, on actual mainland soil. The cats did not disappear overnight. But the question being answered, whether devils can establish, breed, and begin exerting ecological pressure in a landscape they have not occupied for 3 millennia, is being answered in the affirmative, joey by joey, camera trap by camera trap. Australia has the worst mammal extinction rate on Earth. That number did not appear from nowhere, and it will not reverse from a single sanctuary in New South Wales. But the logic Tim Faulkner and WildArk have been testing since 2011 is now producing data instead of projections, and the data says the bet was reasonable. The 26 devils released in 2020 did not fix anything on their own, but they proved that the system works, that a species can come back to land it lost 3,000 years ago and immediately start doing its job. If you want to follow what happens next as WildArk moves toward broader mainland releases, subscribe and share this with someone who still thinks Australia's wildlife crisis is too far gone to fix.